Hi everyone, welcome back to another Phantasy Star Online video. So what I want to talk about today is how PSO used what I like to call passive storytelling to build its world up for the player. Just before we get into the topic of the video though, this will obviously involve talking about the story of PSO, so if you've never completed the game story, or if you're thinking about doing it at some point, you might want to skip this video until you have, just because there will be story spoilers in this. So let's start with answering what exactly is passive storytelling. So I like to think of passive storytelling as a method where either a game, a movie, or a book, basically any entertainment medium, builds elements of its overarching story up by giving information that isn't directly presented to the user. In the context of games, I see this as additional story or background lore that isn't presented via main quests or main story progression. PSO does this extensively, but it's not the only game to use a similar method by far. So those familiar with games like the Dark Souls series are very likely aware that Souls does something very similar, where a lot of items will have small pieces of lore information, even things like loading screens will show you some of the information sometimes. You get the tiniest little pieces of information from unexpected places, and even the environments themselves can sometimes convey important information without directly telling you. So how did PSO achieve this? So the first way I see is probably the most obvious to anyone who's played PSO before, especially prior to Blueburst. So you arrive at Ragol at the start of episode 1 and you see the huge explosion on the surface. The opening cutscene's already told you that Pioneer 1 travelled to Ragol before you, and that your ship Pioneer 2 has followed years later. At that point it's clear that something dire has happened on the surface, and so begins your adventure at that point. However, if you played the game originally on Dreamcast, GameCube or Xbox, or if you didn't do the government quests on Blueburst, what you're presented with upon arriving in Forest 1 is, well, not a lot. This is where the passive storytelling begins in PSO. So as you probably know, most of the story in episode 1 and 2 is delivered via message capsules, which are either from Red Ring Rico in episode 1 or from Heathcliff Flower in episode 2. These chronicle their own journeys, and in doing so they provide you with some important information about the perils on Ragol. Now, own up, how many of you, the first time you played PSO, paid no attention at all to these and just skipped straight through the areas? If you did, you would have actually essentially missed a huge portion of PSO's story. Now, from a modern game perspective, it sounds like a terrible idea. Why would you give players the ability to skip almost the entire story? Perhaps that's one reason why Sonic Team introduced the government quest in Blueburst, as a way to kind of push you towards doing the story. However, I see it a different way. Those who did stop and read all the message capsules were rewarded with the story elements, which would then make the final boss fights all the more impactful. So maybe Sonic Team foresaw that PSO's player base would fall into two main camps. Firstly, you've got the casual players and the rare hunters, which for this video's context we can probably just lump together. Both of these groups probably just wanted to play the game for the sake of blasting through the areas, killing enemies, killing the bosses, and hunting for red boxes. For these groups, the story might be seen as secondary. Now, I'm not saying that they'd have no interest in the story, but it might not be the priority for them. So the other group are those who may have been big fans of JRPGs such as the original Phantasy Star games. Now this group would likely be much more interested and invested in the story elements of the game. So by having the story primarily delivered by those message capsules, players could choose how or if they wanted to engage with the game story. If you wanted to just run into an area, kill enemies, hunt for rares, you could do that. But if you wanted to figure things out, work out what had happened on the planet, and build the story up for yourself, it gave you the opportunity to do that as well. Of course, these capsules were not the only way that PSO indirectly told the story. You had extra information about Ragol and the people of Pioneer 2 that could be found in the side stories, some of which isn't touched on at all in the main story. For example, the entire Black Paper subplot in episode 1 only comes to light if you take the time to do very specific things in the side story. Again, I feel it's there for those who choose to engage with it, but those who want to just ignore it and hunt red boxes can just ignore it completely. So another way that PSO tells a story indirectly is through the environment. So the environment also plays a role in delivering the story. I feel that the first instance of this is when you first arrive in Forest and all the monsters are aggressive. Next you have the transition between Forest 1, which is sunny and pleasant despite the monsters being aggressive, to Forest 2, which is really gloomy, raining, and is generally just a much more oppressive atmosphere. You'll also notice wreckage scattered throughout Forest, which is a very subtle method of showing you that there has been damage from the explosion. This is then hammered home as soon as you see the central dome in Forest 2, which is covered in damage. So as you move into caves, you can clearly see that it's a mixture of natural caverns and man-made elements, so even without reading those message capsules, you can tell that someone has begun to industrialise the area. As the only known settlers on Ragol were Pioneer 1, it therefore stands to reason that Pioneer 1 did it. Moving through the later areas confirms your suspicions more and more, such as the very obvious damage in Mines 2, showing that something catastrophic happened there, which if you played the side story, you'd know that this was caused by Beta 772 or Durrell Lair escaping, combined with the machines going berserk. Now, admittedly, this hands-off approach to storytelling does fall down in places. For example, if you read the message capsules in Ruins, you'll realise that the ruins are actually the remnants of a spaceship, which you'll later discover is essentially a sealed vault containing Darkfalls. If you didn't read the capsules, I'm not sure if you'd understand the significance of what Ruins actually is. You'd probably be able to tell that it's something odd, as in Ruins 2 you can see a lot of the mechanical elements, and I suppose once you get to Ruins 3 you've got all of the biological elements as well. But whether you'd actually get spaceship from this, or sealed casket, I'm not really sure. For the most part though, I feel that the story approach does work reasonably well. So another way that PSO uses to give small pieces of information is in the game's rare items. Some of these contain tiny amounts of story relevant information. For example, the red weapons all have an Easter egg that references Heathcliff Flowen, which I did cover in a video recently. Now some of this information won't make any sense without additional context. For example, in the quest Seek My Master, there is a special Tekka who, if you talk to him, will tell you a story about 3 legendary blacksmiths and their apprentice, who each forged an extremely powerful sword. By looking at the item descriptions, you can actually figure out which swords he's talking about. So the swords Sanga, Yasha, Kamui, and Agito all have very similar descriptions. Sanga says AUW 1963 model made by June. Yasha was made by Kikoku in 2018. Kamui was made by Tengai in 1977, and Agito... oh. Turns out that Agito was so legendary that it inspired many fakes, so how do you tell which is real? Well, it's actually really simple, again by using the item descriptions. We know that each blacksmith and their apprentice created a sword each. We also know that June made Sanga, Kikoku made Yasha, and Tengai made Kamui. All you need to do is look through the different versions of Agito. So the purpose of this quest is to find the master of Shino at Rexil, and he's famous for using 3 legendary swords. Now as you go through the quest you'll actually come across these swords, which are Sanga, Yasha and Kamui, but you won't find Agito. Now if you then go and look up the item descriptions for Sanga, Yasha and Kamui, you can work out from that who the blacksmiths are that made those 3, which is June, Kikoku and Tengai. So what you need to do is look at the list of the different Agitos and look for a different name that isn't one of those 3, and that will be the 4th blacksmith. If you can work that out, then you've got a good idea of figuring out which is the real Agito. I believe there's only about 1 fake made by the same blacksmith that made the real one, so then it's just a question of working out which of those 2 it is, which is a much easier task than working it out from every different version of Agito. So the 4th name is someone called Dosetsu, and Dosetsu is the crafter of the real Agito, as well as one of the fakes as well. So if you didn't have a guide for that back in the day, it would have been a case of showing the Tekka every single version of Agito that you found in the hope that it was the real one. But by engaging with PSO's indirect storytelling, we can actually figure it out ourselves. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't always work. Anyone who tried unsealing the Seal J sword by using all techniques, as the description states, won't have had a good time with it. But I think this is likely just a case of bad localization. For what it's worth, I believe it's meant to mean use all sword techniques, as in become proficient with a sword, as in kill a lot of enemies, which if you know about SGS you'll know that you need to kill 23,000 enemies to unseal it. So before this gets too long, I think I'll wrap things up here. I wanted to cover this as one criticism I've often hear levelled at PSO is that its story is weak and it doesn't tell you anything. On that I do disagree. The story is there, you just need to find it and piece it together for yourself. Or, you know, watch an old British guy talk about it for hours on YouTube instead. So that will bring us to the end of this video. If you have enjoyed it, please consider either liking, subscribing, or joining as a member on YouTube. You can also follow us over on Twitch. I have a X and a Bluesky you can check out as well. And I also have a Discord channel that you can join as well, which I'll leave a link to in the description. But yeah, hope you enjoyed the video and me looking back at how PSO delivered its story. And I'll see you guys in the next video.